Welcome back to Smoked BBQ Source. I'm Ricer, and today we are talking about how I make fresh or cured sausage at home and the equipment that I have used to be able to get the job done throughout the years. Bonus is it can be a lot of fun doing it with the whole family, and it can also save you a bunch of money. Who doesn't like to have breakfast links, brats, and summer sausage? The first thing that you're going to need is a good sharp knife. I like to use a boning knife when I'm trimming up my meat. A boning knife, well, obviously is great for cutting out a bone on a pork butt or trimming up some of the silver skin and that unwanted excess fat. If you're interested in a video of how I keep my knife sharp, leave a comment below and I'll do a video showing the equipment that I use. The second thing you'll need is something to store your meat while you are processing it into sausage. You need to be able to keep this meat cold, so make sure that it fits in your freezer or your refrigerator in between each step of processing and making this sausage. And here's a pro tip: whatever you buy, make sure that it fits underneath that grinder head. Having a couple meat lugs is not only great for handling the meat itself, they can also double as a great storage device for your meat processing equipment when you're not using it. Obviously, you're going to need something to be able to grind your meat and be able to stuff it. For batches of 25 to 50 pounds like I do, it is really nice to be able to have a mixer. They sell them either with a hand crank, or some of them can actually be hooked up right into your grinder. Some grinders can be used as stuffers, but if you do not have a foot pedal, it gets kind of tricky to be able to do it. There are many different brands and sizes and price ranges of sausage making equipment for you to choose from. I typically make 25-pound batches at a crack, so it does help that I have some really quality equipment to be able to get the job done quickly, even when I'm doing it all by myself. All by myself. Don't wanna be. A couple other things that you're gonna need is a sausage prick or a good, sturdy, strong needle. This will help get the air out of the casings and along with getting some of the fat to run out while you're cooking them. I like to use aluminum sheet pans for holding my sausage after I've stuffed them or linked them up, but this is just optional. You will need to get a good scale to measure out your ingredients, especially if you're going to make your own recipe from scratch. I measure out my ingredient percentages into grams. This will help you get a consistent tasting recipe every single time. I also have a bigger scale that I use to measure out the amount of meat that I have. But if you buy boneless meat, then you'll know exactly the weight that you have in product, so you'll be able to measure out your spices. I suggest if you're new at making sausage, you should just buy a kit for your first time. Everything you need will be in that kit to be able to make a great tasting sausage. I personally like to use the PS seasoning kits, and every single one that I've used has turned out fantastic. If you're making large batches like I do, it is really nice to be able to have a vacuum sealer. This way you can just store a bunch and you'll have them for a later date. Yes, one of my freezers is plumb full of sausage because right around the corner it's gonna be spring, and that means it's bratwurst time. Yeah, that is a very good looking bratwurst you have there. For fresh brats, breakfast links, or sausage patties, you can just fry them up in a pan or grill them. But for some sausage recipes, you are going to need to get a little bit of smoke on them. That can be done in many different ways. You can either use a pellet grill, an offset charcoal smoker, but for me, I prefer to use an electric smoker. With an electric smoker, you can get the temperatures much lower, which is a lot better for being able to dry out those casings. When you're making cured sausage like venison snack sticks, Polish kielbasa, or summer sausage. Yeah, I know, I can hear all of you right now saying, "Oh my God, he's so spoiled. Look at all that fancy equipment." No, okay, maybe I am now, but I wasn't, because back in the past, I had to use one of those old hand cranks and an oil can type of stuffer. Cranking and stuffing 25 pounds was an all-day affair. So, like most people, I slowly started to update my equipment. Use whatever you've got, but every single time you make a batch of sausage, write down the cost cost savings from actually having to go buy it at the store. Then put that money away and save it up until eventually you can upgrade to something bigger and better too. It's finally time to talk about how to process some sausage. First thing, typically sausage is always going to have about 25 to 30% fat in it. From my experience, you do want to have at least 25% fat or it's gonna start to taste a little dry. And it doesn't matter if you're using beef, pork, or wild game. For most fresh sausage recipes, you can use pork butt because it has a perfect fat to meat ratio. You're gonna wanna keep your meat nice and cold, and it can be almost frozen right before you start grinding it. But you do not want it to be above 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius for all Utes outside of the US. Utes is just slang for all of you guys. See? I was teaching. If the meat is nice and cold, then I start slicing or cubing it up. But the size depends on how big the throat is on what grinder I'm actually using. Once the meat is all cut up, I weigh it out to get a total so I can figure out the amounts of seasoning or ingredients that I will need to use. Then it goes back in the fridge while I start getting all of my spices made up. My studio fridge is set just above freezing, so yeah, it gets super duper cold. But in the winter here, I have a natural ice box right outside. So that is why winter is a perfect season for me to start making up some sausage. When it comes to spices, there are many different ingredients that you can use. Home Production of Quality Meats and Sausage is a book that I have talked about before. In this book, it has a valuable table of reference of amounts of different spices you should use in a recipe. Once I have all my spices ready, then it's time to get my grinder set up. When you hear people talk about the different size of grinder that they use, that is just a number that is related to that grinder for the amount of meat that it can grind up in a minute. An example is a number 8 can grind about 4 pounds per minute. A number 32 can grind at least 12 pounds per minute. One thing that I have the luxury to do in my studio is that I can keep it nice and cold when I'm making sausage. But sometimes I will also put my grinder head in the freezer so it gets extra cold. The meat will cut a lot cleaner and the fat doesn't start to produce kind of a smeared look while it's grinding. The size of plate that you're using can be optional for the type of texture and bite that you're looking for. For example, on a fresh sausage recipe, I will do one pass through the grinder, either using a 6mm 1/4 inch plate, a 10mm or a 3/8 inch plate, and sometimes I even use a 12mm 1/2 inch plate. On a snack stick or a summer sausage, I will do 2 passes. The first pass is through a 10mm plate and the second is a 4.5 or 3/16 inch plate. But here's a pro tip: whenever you run your meat through a grinder, double check to make sure that it's under that 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and if it's not, put it back in the freezer for half an hour, 45 minutes so it stiffens up again. Some of you might be asking, when do you actually add the spices? Sometimes I might take my spices, throw it on the meat when it's cut, and start grinding. Other times, like on a fresh sausage recipe, I'll just actually coarse grind it, then go ahead, throw my spices on, and hand mix it for around 10 minutes. By hand, that all depends on how hard you want to work and how fast your little paws will go. But whenever it comes to any type of cured sausage, I always use one of my mixers. I have a 25-pound batch mixer and a 50-pound batch mixer. And I use my big mixers because I like to add the curing water to the mix right before I start mixing. Now there's a couple things that we're looking at while we're mixing our meat. Number one, we want to make sure that all of our spices are distributed well throughout that mix. The second thing that we're looking for is that we're starting to get a really nice protein extraction. If you're new to sausage making and you're really not sure what protein extraction looks like, well, here's a couple little tricks. Number one, you scoop it up and it'll stick to the bottom of your hand without falling off. And number two, you can start to see these little feathery little hairs starting to stick off a ball of that mix. It's kind of hard to explain what that looks like, but once you see it, you're gonna know exactly what I'm talking about. Whenever I'm using one of my mixers, I always plan for at least 5 minutes. Then I shut it down, check, and if it's not sticking to the bottom of my hand, I give it another minute or so. Now it's all mixed up, goes those back in the fridge while we get our stuffer set up. Honestly, this is my favorite upgrade that I've made in my sausage and meat processing arsenal. I bought myself a 20-pound electric LEM stuffer. I can run it all by myself and I do not have to clamp it down to the table. If I have a blowout using this stuffer, it is 100% user error. Number one, I forgot to actually back down that speed on the piston when I started setting it up, or number two, I got a little rough putting those casings on the horn. I have multiple different sizes and brands of stuffers, but once I started doing 25 pounds at a crack, I stopped using my 5-pound stuffer. It's way too much work loading up that little canister 5 or 6 times just to do a 25-pound batch. I like to use my 15-pound meat hand crank stuffer when I'm doing fresh sausage with the boys. Filling up hog casings with a hand crank is pretty simple, especially when you got a couple people around to help you out. But when I'm making breakfast links or snack sticks, 100% I'm going to use my LEM electric stuffer. If you're doing this once or twice a year, you don't need a big electric fancy stuffer. When you're loading up your canister, you always want to make sure that you pack your meat nice and tight. This will push out any air pockets in between the handfuls of meat that you just put in. But it never fails, when you get towards the end of the canister, you will sometimes get a little bit of an air pocket in between some meat. But that's really not that big of a deal. You can go ahead and fix that when it's time to start putting those links into that coil. Typically when I do snack sticks, I try to get as much of that casing on that horn as possible. Because these are going into my smoker, I always run them out to a certain length. This way they'll fit in there perfectly. But yes, of course, sometimes you end up with some shorter sticks. With some of the box kits that I get from PS Seasoning, they do have sodium erythorbate, What is sodium erythorbate? Well, that actually helps the cure speed up. So if you have that in the ingredients list, you can stuff it and put it directly into your smoker. If you do not have that in your ingredients list, then you want to let these cure for 24 hours. The other thing about putting it back in the fridge for a few hours, even if you're just doing fresh sausage, that the spices have a little bit more time to blend. On most cured and smoked sausage, I run my internal temps up to 156 or 158 degrees. Then they get a good ice bath to stop that cooking process. I take them out of the water and let them sit on a wired rack and let them dry off and start to bloom for about an hour. Then I start slicing them up into individual links. Then back in the fridge again for another day just to air dry before I start putting them in some vac bags and start sealing them up. When using natural sheep or hog casings, sometimes you can pick them up from your local butcher and they're typically ready to use, or you can get them from the inner zones. They come in a bag packed with salt. You will need to rinse them clean and get all of that salt off. Soak them for an hour in some warm water and repeat the process again for another hour. Now they'll become a lot more pliable, so it's easier to start flushing them out. Here's a pro tip when it comes to using natural hog casings. I like to start the rinsing process the day before. Once I have that all done, I put a half a teaspoon of baking soda in that little tub and let it sit in the fridge overnight. This will help get them a little slippery, so it's a lot easier to load up that horn. Each one of these bags will do right around a 25-pound batch. If I end up having any left over, I just put them back in the fridge, and if I do not plan to do any sausage for 2 or 3 weeks, then I will add some salt to that container, and then they can store up to 3 or 4 months. Whenever I'm stuffing fresh sausage into natural casings, I only try to fill them up about 3/4 full. You want to leave a little room in that casing so it's easier when it comes to twisting up the links. If the sausage isn't nice and plump and it feels a little loose, just go ahead and twist them up a little bit more to tighten them up. There's many different ways to do this, but what I've found the easiest for me is to start the first link, then move over a link and pinch, and then move over again and pinch, and then just twist it up. After I've stuffed all of the natural or collagen casings, I always use my sausage prick to add a few escape hatches. But with any of the fibrous casings that I use for summer sausage, I do not have to do it because they already have holes in in them. We're starting to get to the point where this is becoming a very long video. So I'm gonna keep some of the information back for when we start doing some recipes in the near future. And I hope you're watching this video and you plan to start doing it too. So yeah, hey, it's a good time to become a subscriber. That sounds a little bit more Norwegian than German, but you get the point. We will have a more in-depth review and some of the pieces and parts that I use to make sausage in the description below. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. It's sausage time!